Hey, period party people. Welcome to another episode of the show. So, today's episode is really, really good. I am talking to Mari Dickerson, and she is an integrative coach and psychotherapist specializing in women's health, trauma, and spirituality. So, you know, this is going to be really juicy. Anyway, she holds a master's degree in clinical social work from NYU and has been working in the mental health and healing field for over 10 years. Mari has training in yoga, meditation, Reiki, psychoanalysis, addiction treatment, EMDR, and women's health and hormones. She actually did my women's hormone health certification program a few years ago. So, in her work with women, Mari integrates the basics of menstrual health and body literacy with trauma work and supportive coaching to help female clients reduce symptoms, get in touch with their intuition, and find their feminine power. On this episode, we're talking about the fact that women have different psychological needs than men, surprise, and how Mari has incorporated women's hormone health and menstrual cycles into her work with her patients and clients. And just a reminder before we get into this episode that all of my podcast episodes are now on YouTube, so you can find them over there on my channel. Hi, Mari. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I'm excited to be on.
Thanks. I know. I feel
Yeah,
the same way too. And this is a much needed conversation. So I'm very glad to be having it with you.
likewise.
Yes, right. I'd really love to begin with your background. How did you come to realize that in your work, women who are seeking mental health support need to also have their menstrual cycles and fluctuating hormones considered as part of their evaluation and treatment plan?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I think I'd have to start with my own journey in struggling with hormonal issues and menstrual issues um, as a teen. So, because I've kind of always known about that from my own personal experiences with the Western medical system and kind of going through that. And so, when I was a teenager, I got my period a bit late and then it stopped completely for several years. And I was put on a birth control pill at age 15, almost 16. That caused a lot of issues. Half of my hair actually fell out in high school because of that. So I stopped taking the pill and that it did grow back and I have a lot of hair, thankfully. So it wasn't that bad, but that was really traumatic. And I went off and on of a couple different pills and was trying different things, but I was also diagnosed with PCOS. So I kind of had that profile. Um, and then in my mid 20s, it kind of took that long. I discovered like Ayurvedic medicine and more holistic health, and I shifted my diet. One of the big issues I think had actually been that I was vegan and vegetarian, mostly vegan, for over 10 years. And that diet just really wasn't nourishing my body, but no doctors, gynecologists, nobody really addressed like my diet or my lifestyle. So I was just kind of hopping around for a long time, trying to figure it out, having really irregular cycles, having really horrible PMS half of the month. Sometimes it was almost as bad as like PMDD level, like feeling really depressed and anxious half the time and just kind of out of control, honestly, at times. And then I started working with an Ayurvedic practitioner, and she said, I know you're vegan and it's really important, but I want to give you this medicine and it's best taken in a ghee because it's fat soluble. And at that point, I was so desperate that I was like, I'll do whatever. I'll just do it. I'll take it. And my body, like the moment that like animal fat hit my body, it was like, oh my God, like, what have you been doing? This feels so good. And so that started a whole process of me slowly becoming an omnivore again. And that cleared up a lot, as well as just working with other lifestyle things like learning how to work with my cycle and give myself enough rest and slow down in the luteal and the menstrual phase. And that all of that was life changing for me. So, in my late 20s, I also started graduate school for social work to become a therapist. I'd always loved working with other people, and I've always been very intuitive. And so that just felt kind of like a natural place to go for my career. but I hadn't yet made the connection that like all this stuff that I went through with my menstrual health and all of this stuff that I'm learning now in psychology and learning to become a psychotherapist, that why are these things separate? Like there's this part of my life and there's this part. It's like there's the body and there's the mind, and they're not really going together. And I didn't think about that a lot in the beginning, but as the years went on and I became more experienced as a psychotherapist, I slowly just kind of started making those connections with clients. I was like, well, I wonder if this client is struggling because she's on the birth control pill. Has anyone ever asked her about that? Like, how do we know? How do we rule it out? And just things like that. I think that's the thing that I started integrating first, was looking at the pill and supporting women in, talk to your doctor, but we might consider trying getting off of this and seeing how you feel.
Wow,
so that was a big,
yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I realized that it was, but yeah, it kind of is. And then I went into psychoanalytic training, and that honestly just drove me crazy because it was just there was just nothing about the body, and it was still so mind oriented. And we were reading these really old, archaic papers. And it's not that we were being taught to practice in that way, but I was like, why are we even reading this? Like the way they talk about women, like what even is this? And that's when I was like, these things need to be completely integrated. And so, yeah, now I've been starting to do that more and more, especially after taking your course. So
that brings up something interesting that I think is, something that we all talk about in the holistic alternative world. And it's the constant separation between the brain and the rest of the body, or different systems in the body. When you think about endocrinology, and then you think about psychiatry, and you think about all of these different areas of medicine, and no one's communicating. I was actually just on a podcast episode yesterday talking about this with other women's health practitioners, and the fact that we have lived in this sort of paradigm for so long of like siloed medication or medicine, and we're just not, the rest of all these different doctors, if you're under the care of multiple doctors, are not communicating with each other. And so you're just never really getting this cohesive treatment plan, right? It's so challenging. So I can imagine once you saw the light, how hard it was for you to actually continue with this training. That must've been really challenging.
I didn't. I left.
Oh,
Okay. I didn't complete it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. But it's so good to see this movement, because I feel like there really is a shift in the mental health, psychology, psychiatry field now, where I get the sense that there are a number of practitioners, at least from people I've talked to and heard from, right, that are shifting now and really taking a more holistic approach to mental health. Would you agree with that? Like that's shifting?
Totally agree. I feel it's shifting for sure. And it's so needed. And I mean, the psychology, psychotherapy field has been shifting a lot in terms of the mind-body connection and integrating more like somatic nervous system based things into the work. I would say the field as a whole is not there, but there are a lot of practitioners working more holistically for sure, which is great to see.
Yeah. I hope that there are training programs. I don't know if there are any, to be honest, but I'm really hopeful that if there aren't, that's in the works, because that would be incredible to me, thinking about the profound effect of gut health, gut dysbiosis, different gut related conditions on the brain, or the effect of them on the brain. And once you can address those, as we know, right, your brain health dramatically improves.
Dramatically.
Yeah. Yes. And so there was something you said in the information you sent over to me, and you were talking about the lack of information and education on women's hormones and cycle in the mental health field is like this gaping hole. And your point is that we are different at each phase of our cycle throughout the month or throughout our cycle. And, our hormones really have to be taken into consideration. So can we talk a little bit about that? Like maybe talk about, how you work with someone versus maybe how you used to work with them, or how someone might get help traditionally when they seek mental health help.
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally, let's say a woman comes into my practice and she is struggling with anxiety and burnout. I would mostly address, I would do an intake, learn about her life, learn about her work, all of that. But I wouldn't really be thinking about or asking about her menstrual cycle. It's like, well, how is that? Is it regular? Are you cramping? Like all of those questions that like we would ask women as a health coach. So there's a lot that can go missed there. So we'll be talking about, well, what are you thinking about? And how might this relate to your childhood? And, is this the right job for you? And what beliefs do you have about yourself? And like looking at all of that, engaging the mind, and we could potentially be missing this whole piece that might be hormonal, and a real opportunity to shift and improve some of those symptoms through working with the cycle. So the way that I would approach it now is first to ask intake questions that also include questions about the menstrual cycle. And then if a woman is interested, or if she's coming to me directly for this, we would really just learn about body literacy, like the basics of the cycle, because most women don't know. This is what's so heartbreaking to me. And I didn't know either. And it's part of why I struggled for so long. I didn't know about the hormones in each phases of the cycle. I didn't know how to take care of myself for hormonal health. I didn't know how to care for myself on my period. Like I didn't know any of this information. And so how can we, one of my favorite quotes is from a psychologist, Carl Rogers, and he says, "The great paradox is when I accept myself as I am, I can change." And how can women fully change and fully take control over their health, including their mental health, when there's such a fundamental misunderstanding of this very like vital system that they have? And so we'll start cycle tracking, we'll learn about the phases, and then one thing I really do is look at the luteal and the menstrual phase in terms of psychology, because there's so much that goes on there. In our follicular and ovulatory phase, we have more energy, we're more outward, our hormones are building up towards ovulation, we're more focused on connection, maybe on socializing, more focused on other people. As we move into the luteal phase after ovulation, if we're not pregnant, we start to turn more inward. We start to be more self-focused. We start to need to slow down a little bit more. And we also become more intuitive. And this is really a wonderful time to look at what's going on, what's out of alignment in my life, what are the patterns that come up over and over again, luteal phase after luteal phase, showing me what I need to work on in my life. And so we can work with that with women in a psychotherapeutic context. Like, is it an issue with work that's coming up every month? Is it an issue in your relationship? Is it a trauma trigger, a memory that comes up every month when you're feeling more vulnerable and you're more open to it? And then really sitting with that and gathering that information. And then as women move into the menstrual phase, there's a bit more clarity where they can just kind of sit and integrate. Well, what do I want to do about this now? Now that this thing has been identified, do I need to take action on something? Do I need to set a boundary? Do I need to start thinking about a career change? Do I need to have a conversation with someone? And then when they have more energy and more bandwidth in the follicular phase, they can take action on that. So yeah, that's generally how I do it now.
Oh my gosh, I just love this so much. I'm just listening to you and thinking, oh, I really hope whoever's listening who has been struggling with their mental health, particularly in that second half of the cycle, we know that that's kind of the trouble spot for so many people.
Yeah.
That if they're listening to you, it's really resonating for them, because it just sounds so perfect. It sounds to me like, oh man, can't we just be doing this with everyone at this point? Because that's what we need. Like, I just think all women need this. And, I really appreciate that you just sort of take this real full body approach, and you're starting with cycle tracking, and you're making your clients or your patients super aware of their cycles and what is going on, so that they can take control of the situation. Because what I often find is that we just feel so out of control, and what you're describing is vastly different to the current system, where you just go and you say what you say, and then there's a you're pretty quickly put onto an antidepressant or some other kind of medication. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
That's pretty much
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah. I mean, definitely if you go to see a psychiatrist, that's what
Right.
happens. They'll prescribe medication. Um, yeah. And I think with psychotherapy, I think, a lot of practitioners feel quite limited. Like, well, I'm only trained, this is out of my scope of practice. I'm not supposed to be talking about X, Y, and Z with the body, because that's not what I've been trained for. I've only been, trained to deal with the mind, essentially.
Right. And what
Yeah.
about, asking, you kind of mentioned this, like asking when these symptoms actually started before jumping to medication, like what precipitated them? Because I think that's something too, right? When we're talking about premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, for anyone who's listening and doesn't really know what that is, it's sort of an exaggerated PMS, which we can get into. But I just feel like that didn't just show up, right, for no
Right.
reason. And so I feel like this idea that we are just sort of destined to suffer for multiple weeks out of every cycle for the rest of our lives is such an incredibly disempowering, defeatist approach. And
Yeah.
for me personally, I just don't accept it. And
Yeah. Nor
everyone,
should we.
right? I know. And I like, this isn't to discount anyone's symptoms by any means, because I feel like that sometimes comes up too when I talk about this. Maybe it's the way I talk about it, I'm not sure. But I'm curious what your thoughts are, because I feel like it is upsetting to some people when they hear this, because sometimes, we've searched so long and hard for a diagnosis that we become overly attached to that. And then it becomes
Mm.
part of our identity a
Mm.
little bit. Do you have
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. Thoughts on
Just
like
like
the upset
the
that
yes, the
people.
identification with your diagnosis, especially after you've worked so hard to get the diagnosis. Because I feel like we have to work really hard sometimes to get a diagnosis when we know something's wrong.
Right.
And
Right.
then,
Right.
right? And then, like, okay, and then what's the treatment? Because I think that's the next step that is harder for some of us to deal with, because that means we actually, we have to do the work if we're going to do something like the work that you're suggesting, or that I do.
Yeah. I mean, that is something where people are like, can tend to be like, oh, well, I have depression and it's a brain chemistry issue and I take medication for it. And that's that. And don't say anything else about it, because that's, unkind to me somehow. I think, with all compassion for anyone who's struggling with anything, a lot of it can be caused by other issues. And what I see with women, like you're saying, going to a psychiatrist and just getting on antidepressants, for example, it might be a hormonal issue. Like I've seen that happen where there's been a hormonal imbalance and that's what's making the person feel depressed, but that doesn't get assessed at all. And then they're prescribed an antidepressant,
Right.
which can actually exacerbate the hormonal issue in some cases, like with gut health. And it's certainly not helping the underlying driver. So then that person is just kind of stuck in that unless they go another route or get information elsewhere, which
Yeah.
I think is kind of unethical. um,
That's an
and
interesting take. Yeah.
yeah, and I think, I think some of this comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of women's health. Like it's been so normalized for us to have disorder and pain and all of these things. Um, and that's not actually normal. It's common, like so many people say, but it's not normal. And part of that is because we're still on such a male model system. Just in
Yeah.
terms of the medical model and even the psychological model in some ways. So it's not due to bad intent on anyone's part. It's just a misunderstanding
Yeah. And a lack of
of the
knowledge.
differences and a lack of knowledge. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the differences for sure. And that brings me to the term hysteria. And in this the psychological and mental health field. And I know that's something that we really wanted to talk about, like theories on how that developed in our society, and also how it sort of plays into the patriarchal model of mental health treatment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the history, I've dived into this recently, and the history of hysteria is really interesting because it goes hand in hand, first of all, with society becoming more patriarchal. And it also is a big part of the history of psychiatry and the psychology field that's kind of, it hasn't been totally left out, but it also isn't that integrated. And so hysteria, the first recorded history of hysteria is from 1900 BC in ancient Egypt. They used to see that as a more of a medical disorder located in the womb. They would say that the womb was out of balance with its own rhythm. And they actually believed, like in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, that the womb was wandering up and like crowding the other organs, which we now know, of course, isn't true. And they thought it was due to a lack of sex, or like if a woman hadn't had a child. And so sex was prescribed as a treatment. They also did a bunch of other weird things. As Christianity took over, it was seen as devil worship or possession by the devil if a woman had hysterical symptoms. So the treatment was like exorcism or religious. That evolved into witchcraft. Hysterics were seen as witches. They were even burned at the stake sometimes, or if a woman had hysterical symptoms, they believed that they were the victims of witchcraft. It was a whole mess. And just to backtrack a little bit, hysteria is no longer a medical or psychological diagnosis. It used to be. When we say hysterical now, we think of like someone being overly emotional or disproportionately reactive. Those were symptoms. Symptoms of hysteria could also be like epileptic, like seizures or paralysis of limbs or fainting, pain, muscle spasms, like kind of going into a trance state, emotional outbursts. And this was actually happening. Like there were women presenting with these symptoms. As we move into the 1800s, that's when Sigmund Freud came onto the scene. He was a doctor, an Austrian neurologist. He started working with a lot of hysterical women. He was treating them with hypnosis. And then that evolved into what we now see as psychoanalysis, which was the precursor for modern day psychotherapy, like talk therapy. He developed it through his work with women who had hysterical symptoms. So like that really blows my mind. Like when I think about it, like modern talk therapy was created because women were suffering under patriarchal oppression.
My God, where do we even begin? How do
You
we
know,
even unpack
it's
that?
like it's very intertwined and a very big topic. And he saw this as sexual repression, as repression of trauma, and having these women have a space to let in that unconscious material and talk it through, I think was really helpful to them. And the woman that wrote this history of hysteria that I've learned from is a psychoanalyst named Lori Leighton Shapira, and she wrote this book called The Cassandra Complex. And she talks about in the book how like the symptoms of hysteria have kind of evolved over time to express whatever's being repressed in the culture of that time, which I find really interesting. So like Victorian women were sexually repressed and they were very oppressed by the patriarchy. And so that's what was being expressed. And so moving into modern day, we don't have this diagnosis anymore.
But it was only done away with relatively recently, right?
1980.
Okay, that was after I was born. Are we kidding? That's ridiculous. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so now sometimes people present with these symptoms, they'll be diagnosed with a dissociative disorder or a somatic symptom disorder. Psychologically, trauma is seen as the main root of those. But I also see a really strong parallel with things like PMS and PMDD. I want to be careful. I'm not saying that when you have PMDD, you're hysterical or you have hysteria, because that's not an accurate thing.
Right.
But if we look at some of the symptoms, emotional outbursts, feeling out of control, like having it come on suddenly, just like there's a parallel there. And it's like, if we think about it in terms of what's being expressed, women in our reproductive systems are still being very mistreated and very misunderstood. And so it's fascinating that thousands of years later, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians were obviously very wrong that the womb was wandering around. But there's like this symbolic truth to that, where it's like, no, but the womb is still trying to say something. It's wandering up into these other symptoms that are coming out. And in large part, they're still being misdiagnosed and mistreated and misunderstood.
Yeah.
So,
like the mechanism isn't quite the same as they thought, but the treatment options haven't really evolved that much, have they? Yeah.
no,
I know.
I mean, they have and they haven't.
They haven't. Right. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you
Yeah.
were going to say something about that, about how they've evolved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we definitely have more of an understanding now medically of what is going on with women. It's just that that's not making it through to like the practices that are used medically.
Yeah. As is evidenced by what you shared in the beginning about the way that you used to practice versus what you're doing now. And you mentioned PMDD, and I feel like this is something that I would love to talk about a little bit more, just because, first of all, I think that it is a condition that not a lot of people know about, at least outside of the women's health space. And I think a lot of women really struggle and they don't realize that there is a potential diagnosis. But I think that there's, again, something interesting around this condition. So for anyone who doesn't know, so it's premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD. And typically you would see symptoms in the 1 to 2 weeks before your period begins. And it is classified as a psychiatric disorder. So, this has made it helpful, I think, to some degree, right, for getting a diagnosis. Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And just like it's legitimized, I suppose you could say, versus
I think
just being a hysterical woman.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. I think that that's helpful to have that medical understanding for sure.
Right. And so I think that for someone like me who is a women's health coach, and I've been focused on nutrition and lifestyle changes and gut health and all these other things, when I think of like premenstrual syndrome, PMS symptoms or premenstrual symptoms, I see so much incredible improvement when women are, following my protocol, for instance, or just following a protocol that changes the way they're eating and the way they're living and supports their nervous system and all of that. And so I think that there are really important overlooked steps that people can take to start to feel better. And so for instance, like with, these conditions, we have to think about the fact that there are, increased pro-inflammatory molecules in that luteal phase compared to the follicular phase, particularly right before you actually get your period. And so there is even some research that shows that women with premenstrual symptoms have increased pro-inflammatory markers compared to those without the premenstrual symptoms. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that tends to get overlooked too, in lieu of just getting a diagnosis for a condition so that we can sort of categorize ourselves as something. And that I think can be really challenging, because once you're sort of boxed into that, getting out of that sometimes becomes hard. That's been my sense, at least, or my observation.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that that's kind of analogous to just being kind of stamped with a diagnosis of like depression or an anxiety or disorder. And now you take a pill for this, and that's that. Whereas there are so many lifestyle shifts and hormone testing and all kinds of things that can be done and tweaked and looked at to really improve PMDD beyond just like having the diagnosis and knowing about it.
Yeah.
Like the pro-inflammatory markers, like you said. I think something that would really help bridge the gap between the mental health field and like the women's health coaching field is if there was more education on like, this is a disorder. This is something that not a small number, unfortunately, of women are suffering from. It's important to know how to assess for it and then know like where to refer women out to get proper treatment for this and to get all of the information. Because I don't think we can expect the majority of mental health practitioners to know, everything to do to support a woman with PMDD. But it would be great if they knew how to identify it and then, send them to the appropriate resources.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that that's really what this is about. And just thinking again about, the changes that happen in that second half of our cycle when we are typically more inflamed, because menstruation is kind of like a pro-inflammatory event in our cycle. And what's happening with our gut health to begin with, right? Is there some kind of dysbiosis? Is there SIBO or H. pylori or, parasites or something like that that's triggering this sort of inflammatory cascade that is causing sort of a heightened response in that second half of your cycle, particularly? Or, because I think that there's, a good amount of research that shows that, the effect of our gut on our brain via the gut brain axis. And so it makes sense that somehow would be connected with the menstrual cycle fluctuations as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I know it's complicated and yet
It's really complicated.
right? It is. I know, because there is no real easy solution to this. And it's like exactly what you were saying in the very beginning. This really does require a whole body approach. And as of right now, that is just not how it's done. So it becomes so challenging. Maybe you can talk a little bit about someone who does experience these extreme symptoms in the second half of their cycle. Like, what do you typically have them follow a similar protocol to what you described in the beginning of the episode when we were talking about what you do with your patients?
Yeah. I mean, I would always start with just like cycle tracking, learning about the phases, looking at, nutritional support. Because I'm also a coach and I've done your program now, like I know like to refer people out or like to instruct them like what testing they can do so we can look at what's going on hormonally. I also think psychologically there's a lot to work with. So it can kind of, you so well described everything that's going on with the body, in extreme PMS or PMDD. That can also become a feedback loop with what's going on psychologically, because if we haven't had the language to understand, why do I feel this way half of the month? Why am I maybe even kind of blowing up my life, getting in fights with people, feeling totally dysregulated? I mean, for myself, even like I used to try and like break up with my boyfriend like every cycle when I was in that space because I just like felt totally out of whack. And so that can create, some negative self-beliefs that can kind of become a self-perpetuating thing as well. When women don't have a framework and a context for even why this is happening to them or why they're feeling so out of control. So it can just be having that psychoeducation and that education around the hormones and around what's happening can reframe the whole thing psychologically. Oh, like I know why this is happening now. There's a path to it getting better. I know kind of what supports to put around myself during that time of my cycle. I cannot be, overexerting or exposing myself to super stressful situations, or like, I know I need to slow down. I know I need to focus on balancing blood sugar at this time. Because it's really traumatic. It can be really traumatic to have this thing happening in your body and feel like it's out of your control and there's nothing that you can do. So when women start to learn that there are things that they can control, even if they're still having symptoms,
Right.
it's going to be a really big shift psychologically in terms of how they're relating to the whole situation. It's like a
Yes.
different narrative.
Completely. I think about this, and I know we've both seen this in clients, over the years, that massive shift when they go from feeling helpless and hopeless to in control and having an understanding, and really getting to know their biology and why they're feeling the way they're feeling. I've been a big proponent of that for so many years. Like, if you explain to women what's going on and why they're experiencing these things, they'll they're much more inclined to make these changes, because they know that that's going to lead to inevitable positive results, rather than just saying, oh, well, just do this or just do that, and and them not having a real understanding of
Yeah.
why they should be doing that. So yeah, I mean, hugely important. And then the other thing that I think that we should totally touch on is the pill, and or hormonal birth control in general, but particularly the pill, I think, just because it's, really it's still the most popular form of birth
Yeah.
control, right? And it's been around for so long. And how that causes, first of all, imbalances our hormones, because that's technically what it's supposed to do, which makes sense. It's mechanism of action, and
Right.
how it disrupts our mental health, and what it does. Can you speak about that a little bit from your experience or with
Definitely.
clients?
Yeah. Yeah. I have quite a bit of experience with this at this point, because this was, like I had said earlier, this was the first way that I really started integrating the women's health piece with my psychotherapy work. I think there's three main things that I've seen. Obviously, the mental health side effects, which I'll talk about. Then there's also sexual side effects. And then it really cuts some women off from their intuition. So, to talk about the mental health piece, yeah, I mean, it can increase, I think it's as much as 50% of women who take hormonal birth control have mental health side effects. I think it might even be higher.
Shoot, is it that high? I didn't realize it was that high.
I
I mean,
might
I
be,
know that, like, it depends on their age, and our brain isn't fully developed until around age 25. So I know that
yeah,
that also has potential implications for those who are under that age.
yeah. I think I
Yeah.
had read that. I know that it's high. And
Yeah.
so there's been a lot of women who, come to my practice. They're really anxious. They're really depressed. They're having all these symptoms. I notice that they're on the pill, and then we talk about that. And I've seen a lot of improvement when they go off of the pill. It just, I really think this needs to be a big part of the assessment process. Like, if someone is coming to a gynecologist, for example, or a GP, and they also have a mental health diagnosis, I think there really needs to be a fully informed conversation with women about, like, if you're already struggling with your mental health, this might not be the best option for you, because it can really exacerbate issues that are already there and
Yeah.
just make it
Personalized medicine,
even
basically.
more complex. Yeah.
Right.
um and then, of course, it can just, be the cause on its own. So I've just seen numbers of women at this point, like, have a lot of relief and coming off of the pill, learning a little bit more about their cycle, choosing a different option for birth control. um and I've even had women who weren't even on it for birth. They'd been on the pill for years because their doctor just put them on because they were having menstrual symptoms when they were a teenager, and they just never went off because they keep being repeatedly told, oh, well, you had PCOS or you had cramps. And so unless you want to get pregnant, you need to be on the pill, which is kind of a trauma in and of itself.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's sort of the reaffirmation for them over and over again that their bodies just don't work, right? You don't work without this pill. And
yeah,
it's like, it's terrible to grow up with that belief system that your body is somehow inherently broken,
it
and
is.
the only way you can not have painful periods, or the only way you can have
Yeah,
a period, or the only way you don't have heavy periods, or whatever, we could go on, right? Insert whatever condition, is to take this thing or to have this IUD. And I was thinking of the Danish study, actually, that when you were talking about that 50%, there's a huge Danish study that was done. I can't remember when it was done. It was relatively
That's what I'm
recent.
thinking of.
Yeah, right. And that was in that study. They found that 50% of women, or women who were on hormonal contraceptives, were 50% more likely to be diagnosed with depression 6 months after starting the
Okay, that's what it
contraceptives.
was.
Yeah, which, you know, is huge. And then you compare it to women who were not prescribed hormonal contraceptives. So that's in comparison to those women. And then, you know, the other thing is the teenagers. Like, that to me is the most criminal part. And in that same
Yes.
study, it was like women ages 15 to 19, they had an increased risk of depression, like significantly so, much more so than someone who is over the age of 19. So we've just, you know, we've taken, I was talking about this, you know, recently. We've taken women out of the equation of their treatment plan, right? So there's so little individualized attention,
Yeah.
and that is, you know, such a huge problem. And I think that what you're doing is amazing to sort of like bring it back to their individual biology.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything else about the pill or hormonal birth control? You know, actually, there was something else I wanted to talk about, because I feel like what you were saying earlier, just describing these severe premenstrual symptoms, and how much, to me, they're so reflective of uh, our incongruence with our
Yeah.
biology, is how incongruent it is with
Yeah.
the world around us and the society that we've created. What are your
Yes.
thoughts on that?
I mean, we're cyclical beings. If you're female and you haven't gone through menopause yet, you're cycling. And that affects everything. And we live in this world that is very male oriented in terms of the male body. That's just the way that it's been designed. Men are on a 24-hour testosterone cycle. It peaks in the morning, it stays pretty much stable. And that's what our world has been built around. So just from like sex to dating to work to exercise to eating to how our society deals with stress, just all of it um, is not really taking into account women's cycles and the fact that we have different nutritional needs, different physiological needs, different emotional needs at different times of the month. And so, I mean, in my work now, I'm really just sitting with this open question of what does this do to our psychology to be
Right.
living in a world that has not been built for us. And we've come so far in terms of women's rights and the choices that women have and all of those things, but we've left female biology behind, in my opinion, in that fight in some ways. And so we're in a really weird place right now with all of that.
I love that you just said that. We left female biology behind. It does really feel that way. It absolutely
Yeah,
does, based on the fact that we don't have anywhere near the research that we have on men. And
it's atrocious. I mean, that
right.
makes my blood boil, like the research issue. And I get that it's more complicated because we're not the same week to week, but I don't really accept that
No,
as an
I like
excuse.
fully reject that as well. I know, right? It's like, are you kidding me? Yes, of course it's more complicated, but go do your job.
Yeah.
Be a
Yeah,
scientist and do your job.
absolutely.
Like, come on, give me a break. Like, when did we ever shy away from things because they're a little bit harder? That's not how this works.
Yeah.
You know, and that brings up perimenopause and menopause. And I'm so curious what your thoughts are on this, right? Because, of course, we're losing progesterone, which has pretty much like a direct line of access to our brains. And so every single cycle, you know, we're making this progesterone when we ovulate, which is
Mm-hmm.
amazing and so lovely.
Mm-hmm.
But for many of us, as you well know, in that, you know, in the 20s, 30s, early 40s, uh, progesterone production can sputter because of like all the lifestyle things that we've been talking about. So
Right.
that's problematic, but you still have the chance to, you know, work on your little eggs and get that progesterone going again in many cases. But as you head into your 40s, like early, mid, late 40s, that your your egg quality declines, obviously, your follicle health declines. So you just don't produce as much. And so you're losing your progesterone, which is, I joke, it's like the keep calm and carry on hormone, because it kind of is. And so you're losing that. And then you also start to lose your estradiol, which is so critically important as well to brain function, nervous system health, cognitive function. And so I'm curious about your experience of working with women in their 40s. And I just feel like so much shows up there, like thyroid problems start to show up, and that
Mm,
inevitably leads to all kinds of other issues, because of course your thyroid is so important. And
yeah.
I feel like that's another massively overlooked time frame in women's lives, where usually what I hear is, I've been put on the pill. Can you believe it, Nicole? I'm like, yes, I can believe it, because I have super heavy periods now because I'm in perimenopause, or I've just been prescribed an antidepressant, or I'm on thyroid medication. It's like a rite of passage to me. So I'm curious
Mm.
if you want to unpack that one.
Yeah, I admittedly I know a lot less about menopause right now. I want to correct that. I don't have many clients who are at that age. Most of my clients right now are younger.
Yeah.
But what I do know is that if I psychologically, what I've read, I think Dr. Christiane Northrup has talked about this, is that moving into menopause is this shift from, maiden mother into the crone phase, which I don't really like that word, but it's like
Me
this
neither.
shift into like greater wisdom. You're moving out of being on a cycle, and women are coming even more into themselves, is in the ideal psychologically, is what I've read about. So if you had the ideal, time cycling and really honoring your cycle and learning from that and really like delving into the feminine, it can be like an easeful transition where women are able to focus even more on themselves, ideally, because they're not in their child rearing years. They're not in those years where society is kind of asking more from them. And so that's when women actually can come more into their masculine, is what I've seen. They can really start to dominate in their careers. Not that you can't before that, but that's when like they might have more space to focus on that. That's what
Mm.
I have thought about psychologically, but I don't know
Yeah.
as
I
much
mean,
about it.
but that's great. And I agree that that's 100% happening. And then that, from that physical perspective, I just feel as though all of that is happening from a psychological perspective. And then there's all this physical turmoil with our hormones. And it's
Yeah,
almost like a perfect storm. And again, I just don't think that we're crossing ships crossing in the night. Like, we don't really know how to handle that,
how to support that.
right? How to support that. And so maybe that's like the next iteration of your work.
I'm sure it will be.
Right?
Yeah, I definitely want to learn more because I
Yeah.
think, women, I don't know, there's so much misogyny in that still as well, like feeling like, oh, well, you're getting older now and you're not worth as much or whatever, like all of those cultural narratives, which I'm sure is in the mix for women going through that transition. And it's just BS.
Mm.
It's not true at all.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, thank you so much. This was such an enlightening conversation. Is there anything that you want to share with listeners that you feel like maybe you didn't touch on, or just like some parting words for anyone who might be struggling with their mental health and feel like maybe, oh,
Mm,
maybe this, my cycle has
the
something to do
missing
with this.
piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been really fun. I mean, I think maybe the last thing I'll say, if I didn't already, is that we as women, we really have this amazing intuitive blueprint in our bodies through our cycle just built in. And there's so much power to tap into there if you just, and there's so many books out there, like your book is amazing. There's a ton of resources that women can start just engaging with on their own if they're curious to start learning more about this part of themselves and um yeah, have a more holistic, maybe embodied understanding of themselves and their psychology.
Thank you. Thank you
So
for saying that. That's so beautiful. And I would love for you to share where everyone can find you and your work.
yeah, thank you. They can follow me on Instagram at intuitive psychology. That's all lowercase. I'm kind of just getting started on there. And my website is maridickerson.com. So
Amazing.
feel free to
Thanks,
connect
Mari.
there. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you. That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at nicolejardim.com/quiz.